computer language,
Yeah.
it's usually the same. Sure. If you don't mind.
Yeah.
By whom? Oh,
Right.
and then we start,
And then
and
I'll
so.
leave it to you. Just to get on this right
Oh, they have that. Oh, is it here?
So the original was,
Uh-huh.
we should be serving coffee now.
You should be serving
So if you want to pour something, it would have been.
Get my good side, please.
Were you Barbara Streisand? But at the same time, you need to do something that's low enough.
Yeah, because people are also like putting light and stuff.
So you should be able to replicate it with a flashlight,
Yeah.
right, because that's part
Do you want a
of
cup
it.
of water? Shall I get you some?
Light,
Yeah, I left my water somewhere.
2 needles, and 2 dry, which means that there's a spoiler, and actually, it's not close to dry, it's like a meter A, 4 people, it's actually 3, so there's.
But those are your cards, how will you know what to say?
The ones that need.
If you have a moment.
I'm just trying to get there. It is like 3:30.
So the other piece of that would be
And then, yeah.
the decisions we made.
Was this here?
Students who did week, right?
Oh,
Right, and so that means it's a digital device, which means you're not going to have audio.
Yes.
So that's why it needs to be sound.
oh, okay.
And another thing that's wonderful is that it's in the context of a museum. So there's backward books.
Oh.
That might work.
For it to be successful, the pieces need to distinguish the
The
sound
sound
theory
from the
from the background.
yeah, that's right.
Right, exactly. And so
Perfect. I can
the
share
strategy for that was to use frequency. So, and that's something you could have implemented at the time using it. But there's different. But basically, so that the agents listening to a very specific frequency.
We'll start in a couple of minutes. They're still having so much fun.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a light. Do you ever see it working when the lights are off, right?
Yeah.
Still pictures are beautiful.
Yeah.
It's not warm.
Yeah.
And it's actually illuminated from that side. So
Oh, okay, yeah, I gotta wait for you, and then you wanna give me yours? Please. Oh.
someday,
If you need me,
excellent
you
coverage.
can find
Maybe
the
next
next
year.
one.
Okay.
I'm trying to try and latch onto this one.
Yes. It feels a little, but they are steps.
Don't worry, I will run.
Okay. Don't you?
I'm one of those idiots that like climbs around like that. So I should be able
We went way back.
Are you a photographer?
No.
You just play around?
Well, photographer. I take pictures.
Here we go.
He's
There's only 1,600 photos.
I have lots of cameras. I have, you know, nice cameras. I have expensive cameras.
So there's, and this
I have lots of them actually. So generational cameras. In fact, I've got a whole shelf full of digital cameras. That's sort of,
You're a camera collector.
so I'm a camera collector.
Oh, I always thought
Yeah.
that the pieces were,
No?
you know.
No.
Oh my goodness. So it's like.
I was just, my grandchildren were just with me in Manhattan, and one of them fashions herself as a fashionista, and the other one couldn't do. So she'd say, I'm going to walk this way, take a photograph of me.
So we
Oh yeah,
And
wow.
I said to the little one who was doing all the photographing, these are great. You're getting a whole career built up here.
Yeah, well, absolutely, because I mean, young people today are seeing everything through their phones,
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
great and terrible.
It's great and terrible, like everything.
Yeah,
Like all young people, great and
yeah.
terrible.
Although, I mean, the thing that is potentially more terrible is if they are on them all the time
Here we are.
and not doing anything else,
So this is a
and
sample.
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
under the age of 16 and their brains aren't developed. What I'm beginning to read is that there are
Well,
significant brain development problems and cognition problems.
and emotional. And emotional.
Well, and emotional, absolutely. And in fact, I was talking to Stephen earlier, and he was saying the rise in autism may be associated with continual iPad use of young children. So my sensitivity to that has been raised over the last week and a half, and it's sort of part of my next 10-year agenda is to work on whatever we can do to, you know.
If you watch kids do Snapchat,
Yeah.
the question of what's real and virtual is
No,
totally mixed.
absolutely. And Snapchat, I was told 2 weeks ago, is the biggest drug market in the world.
Yep.
Join you in the premium sport here.
Here they come.
Here they come. What?
The only thing to say is that it's challenging
On my side.
it's challenging to fully copy the ASC YouTube channel.
designed it.
Because every time you start a new session, you have to update the screen keeper. I'm on video. It's like a set video. So I have not been able to, like in this one, it's not on ASC YouTube, it's only on, it's recorded, it's on Vimeo, and so you can download it and you can put it on the channel. But I have done some of it, like
Can I ask to take the bottle just for a second? To take out the bottle? The bottle.
the bottle, to take the bottle.
It's lovely.
I want that.
We were like
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. When did I lose control? Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, Paul, welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day and a
Really?
wonderful one, and we appreciate you staying.
Yeah.
The name of the session is Cybernetics. So what?
I did not choose that.
Cybernetics.
But you agree?
So what? And you have to say it that way. It's not so what or so what. So what? You got it? And the little thing with the lip?
So what?
So what?
No. You don't quite have it. Cybernetics. So what? All right, it's varying a little bit.
Yeah.
But the subtitle is Questions After 50 Years, in the Field, which we have trouble admitting.
I didn't want that either.
After 40 plus years.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit of a fudge.
20 years.
So, Patricia will open and we'll tell a few stories, and I will tell a few stories, and then we want to engage everyone in everyone's stories. We don't want to tell you.
It's okay.
The obvious.
It's magic.
We'd like to tell you what we've felt and experienced and what we feel is not necessarily catapult into the future, but a basis for thinking about the future. Because as always, as you've heard from me, my concern, and that is the word I choose, is our future, the society's future, the discipline's future. And we don't want to dwell, and we don't want to obsess, and we don't want to remain in the past, but we ask the questions, how did we get here? And if you'll forgive me, I would like to read just a little more. What did we expect at our start in cybernetics? And what do we get?
what do we still want? And would we have to, what would we have to do that we've never done before to get what we still want? These are just some framing questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Patricia.
Yeah. So I guess well, thank you so much for staying. I think I should say that again. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I thought myself I might not. So I thought I would say what happened to me and how I got to where I am now, and I hope that's interesting. But Paul and I practiced Zooming, and we had so much fun going back and forth. We decided to try to get there as fast as we can.
Oh yeah.
Conversation.
Did you see what I did there?
No. What?
I just went back and forth.
Okay.
Okay.
So I met Ivan Illich in 1970 in New York City, for those of you who know him. And he said, you must come to Mexico this summer at Cuernavaca, where he located himself after he got excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And there's going to be a group of people there talking about, the quaint title was Technology for Democracy, and come in August, it'll be great. So I arrived in August. Of course, it had happened in July. He gave me the wrong date. And I asked people about it, and they said terrible, it was awful, evil, all evil people, really bad. And I met one man who said it was fabulous, and so I married him. I did. And he gave me a tape. It was Herbert Groom, if I remember correctly. And it just blew me away. I was in a master's program in sociology at the time. What I heard there so unsettled my mind gloriously. I happily got 2 C's in the next semester. One paper I wrote was Science as Ideology, and the professor said, impossible. Yeah, we've come a long way.
In 1970.
I forget what the other one was. I got a C in, but so I wrote an essay, and they let me have a master's and sent me away. And the husband and I, the husband had been Rodney Clough. Some of you may know him. He did some of the images in cybernetics of cybernetics. Wanted to go to BCL, Biological Compute Lab in University of Illinois. I said, well, that tape was interesting, I'll go with you, of course. We were married, and so we went. And when I arrived, I always remember Heinz came to Stephen, what's Steve's last name? Somebody?
Sloan.
Who?
Stephen Sloan.
Stephen Sloan. We were staying with Stephen Sloan because we had no place to stay. And Heinz came and said, where's the wife? And so I appeared, and he said, I've been out all day sweeping the streets of Champaign-Urbana for your arrival. I was really saying that. So, I didn't know whether I was going to take to all of this. I really didn't always know what was going on. And as I said a little earlier, Heinz said, this is great. You have no background really, so you can be a creative mind. And after getting 2 C's in a graduate program, that was really helpful to me, that he thought I could have a creative mind. And I did, and I learned a lot. But I'm just looking at a few things so I remember what I want to say. When we arrived in Champaign-Urbana, Heinz had invited Rodney there and me coming along for a proposal he had submitted to the Navy. I think it was the Navy that often funded, called a College of Cognition. They turned down the proposal. So when we arrived, Heinz said there is no money, there is no College of Cognition. And what really happened after that was just a bunch of kids. I mean, we were really young. At 27, I was probably older than some of the people that were there. We we created, because there was no program anymore. And we did finally create Cybernetics of Cybernetics, that huge book. A bunch of kids, the most beautiful creation. If you haven't ever seen it, it's really amazing. Oh, some people.
I have copies.
It's quite wonderful.
Not with me, write to me.
And I was telling Paul recently, the queer theorist and critical theorist Eve Sedgwick has written about cybernetics as this period being the cybernetic fold, when there was really no technology. I don't think I never touched a computer while I was at the biological computer lab. We were imagining all the time. We imagined what the machine could do, and if the machine could do that, what could the human being do? And if the human being could do that, what could the machine do? And the way we imagined that was to choose as many kinds of vehicles as we could find. Art, music, dance, anthropology, sociology, politics, epistemology, ontology, to think through what this movement between the human and the machine, the cybernetic fold, which I've always really loved that idea. Kids, so while we were a bunch of kids, nonetheless, people visited the biological computer lab. So I spent lots of time with Gordon Pask, lots of time with Chico Maturana, lots of time with Herbert Brun, of course, who was there. And when I said before argue, Maturana and Brun used to like to argue over politics, of course. With Brun, a group of us read Das Kapital while I was at UCL.
I can imagine that.
Yeah, we did critiques of capitalism, critiques of art. It was just fabulous, and it just went on all the time. There were no classes really. We would sit around. We'd sit in Heinz and Maya's house, or we'd sit in classrooms also. And I can remember Gordon coming once and just filling the blackboard all around the room with like little storylines and P individuals. And Gordon's wife, Elizabeth Pask, was always around also. I want to say very quickly that for myself, Heinz and everyone around him, but Heinz especially, and I don't think I did appreciate Heinz so much, but Heinz was sort of the master of ceremonies. So it was always someone else he was pointing to, and so someone else to listen to. And so I just took him for granted in that way, that he sort of was the director, the leader of everything. And but one of the things I did notice about him was that he was working his way through philosophy. Because we didn't use the machine very much, there was a great deal of discussion about philosophy. The philosophy of mind, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of mathematics. But the philosophy that people were still working out in 1970 was kind of positivism, how to move away from positivism, kind of post-positivism. When I left, and I mentioned that, Wittgenstein, Heisenberg, maybe. I forget exactly. I remember Wittgenstein a lot because he's related to Heinz somewhere in the family. I wanted to just do this for a minute and then over to Paul. When I left BCL, I got a job. Well, I had a baby, which did a few things. And then I got a job, a tenure track job at Fordham University. And it was in sociology. And they really didn't promise that I'd ever get tenure, and I really wanted to get tenure, of course. So every time they had some new course to teach, they said, "Would you teach it, Patricia?" And I said, "Of course, yes, I will teach. I'll do anything, right?" So they gave me the course that was newly developing called Sociology of Mass Communications. So I didn't know anything about television or film, so I said, sure, I can do it. And it was while teaching that course and learning about film and television, which I want to get back to in a minute, that I realized that cybernetics and technology should be part of mass communications. I was ahead of my times because certainly we were not thinking that way at BCL. The technology was not mass communication technology. If I'm right, I don't remember that we discussed it very much. But it sent me into film theory, which was dominated at the time by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And that led to the French, Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari. And so the philosophy I went from cybernetics to was not at all anything that was happening at BCL. That wasn't what was happening because they were of a generation that was really working on something else, which was important to me. I mean, I totally learned. When Maturana did autopoiesis and explained the organism's relationship to the environment, I mean, it ruined my mind. When I would go back to sociology, I kept saying, no, that kind of thing, no, we already, there's some other way to think, that's really something else. And what I remember about BCL, which I've been thinking about the day and a half that I was here, we were always imagining possibilities, really, really stretch. I feel sometimes like I'm still realizing things I heard in BCL. Still realizing in disciplines that are way behind. Psychoanalysis, sociology, biology, it's still happening in a way. Post-structuralism, and this, when I read Derrida on page 9 of grammatology, he mentioned cybernetics, and I thought, cybernetics, there it is. And because I wasn't thinking about it so much anymore. It was now, in the late 80s, and I was thinking much more about the French. And Derrida had an idea that has really shaped most of my work that came after it. Originary technicity. And by originary technicity, it was a deconstruction of Heidegger, of the distinction between nature and culture, but nature and techne. Phusis and techne, as neither nature nor techne could be originary. So although it was originary technicity, if you know Derrida, there was a big X in between over originary. What that meant was that all of human nature was always already technical or technique, not nature as opposed to technique. But not only human nature, but all nature, all matter. So one of the things that originary technicity brought with it was the notion of indeterminacy. That not only was nature indeterminate or humans indeterminate, because indeterminacy is hugely important. Input, output, no. Input, indeterminacy, output. I mean, this was, second order cybernetics, but already first order cybernetics, that there's something indeterminate between the input and the output. Very important for politics, very important for thinking. Nobody just reacts. There's always an interpretation, something in there, indeterminate outcome. But not only human nature, but all nature, but more than that, all matter. So that matter is indeterminate, which became for me, matter is self-informing or informational. And drawing on information theory and all that came after it, the notion of a dynamic matter. And I think this is really important because I heard some things today that, in my world of critical theory, we would not say anymore that humans have agency and that it's what's special about humans. That everything has an agency to it because everything is indeterminate. And so there's always some process that goes on in the movement of time, let us say. To think of, and this is my last thing, and then we'll talk after Paul tells about his, to think of something like matter as indeterminate or dynamic means that it's open to an entanglement with new technologies, as is biology. And this is really important to me about how we critique digital technologies, generative AI. We must start from understanding we're already entangled in technicity. There's no technology out there and we're over here and that we could just be against it. Any critique of it has to start with this notion of originary technicity, which is really a Derridian term. And that has been one of my thoughts. I had some arguments with Matt Tarana about this. Matt Tarana is so much fun to argue with because he never gives in. He listens, he smiles, but never gave in to me. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this in the past. I'm sort of doing other things now, but about the organism being closed to information, as he would argue. And I think that there's something that we need to rethink about the organism, and certainly to think about the body as not reducible to the organism, but as something else. A little bit, so we can blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
Awesome.
What
Wow.
does that?
Thank you.
Amazing.
You're welcome.
Question?
The people that it's very interesting because cybernetic, in the world of critical theory, which has really been my career, feminist theory, post-colonial theory, critical race theory, those politics as part of knowledge production, part of performance and action. I forgot what I was going to say that, but that was good enough to say that anyway. Cybernetics has been only thought of as terrible because of its relationship to war technology, its relationship to discipline and control, its relationship to surveillance, its relationship to capitalism and to global capitalism. And it's been hard over the years for me to remember the cybernetics that I met and the gifts that were given to me at Biological Computer Lab, as I said, still thinking through them, to also face those critiques, which of course can be made, whether you call it cybernetics or technology. And I've held out, I really have held out for understanding the complexities of technology and its entanglement with the human, and that there's a better way to understand that entanglement than just think it's bad. I do think capitalism is bad. Herbert Bloom would insist that I learn that. In 1984, Paul and I met, and in 1984 I won some kind of, I don't know, NEH grant, I think, to go to a conference in Champaign-Urbana. It just happened to be called Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture. Mm-hmm. And there was a tremendous, interesting overlap between things on my mind, structuralism and Marxism and media technology. And being involved in film and television gave me I'm sorry if I'm jumping around too much, gave me a head start in understanding cybernetics and social media, because I was doing communication technologies and television and film. I was ready to start talking about social media very early. The algorithm, years and years, most of my graduate students have worked with indeterminacy of the algorithm and how it works. And so it's always, the critique for me is always about finding where indeterminacy is and supporting that in whatever arrangement you're looking at.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Question?
Yeah.
Were the biological computers fireflies running foundries, or were they you?
Pardon me? I didn't hear. Was that?
Were the biological computers fireflies running foundries, or were they you?
They were me.
So there's some, I think, lovely, if I may call them that, contrasts here. I read every book in the library before I got to be an undergraduate about computers because none were available. And when I entered undergrad in '69, I had been the product of a brother who was very engineering and science and tech-oriented, fixed all the cars and became an architect and an urban planner and a developer. And another brother who introduced me to Wagner and Eric Satie and J.R.R. Tolkien and all of the things that we think of as a humanistic world, although they both crossed over. And so when I got to MIT, I thought, wow, I'm going to be able to play with computers, which I did a bit. And I wanted to sit at the feet of the priests of AI of that era, which were Minsky and Papert. And I took the classes, and I was enthralled for about a semester or so. And then I realized that what they were worried about was how to make the machine into something humane. And in an intuitive way, this was unsatisfying to me. And I couldn't articulate how it was unsatisfying until I met Gordon Pask. And he was a consultant to the Architecture Machine Group. He's working with Nicholas Negroponte. And he, I believe, although Nicholas will never admit this, even if I ask him with a straight face, I believe that it was Gordon's ideas about conversation that was the seed of the Architecture Machine Group, which was, can you have a conversation, not an interaction, not a Q&A, but a conversation with machines about designing? Not telling the machine to give me a rendering or how fat should the beam be or what color is commonly used or even now today pattern generation. But what are we trying to do here and why are we trying to do it? And what are the goals that we might have in the sense of what do we wish to achieve with the building that we're designing and how do we go about modifying them? And so it was clear that Gordon had what no one else that I could find of the time had, which was, of course, a form of cybernetics. He called it conversation theory, etc. So what I expected upon first coming across cybernetics was that this was 1976 when I met Pask. Great, a couple years we'll be doing conversation machines, architecture machines, going to keep going, it's going to be great, and in a few years we're going to really have a rich, collaborative, co-design relationship with machines. That's what I expected. What I got was crickets. Nothing. The architecture machine itself had already started morphing into this hardware-software lab of new experimentation. We had the first commercially available touch screen, which people said was never going to work. People from the government who had funded this. It's never going to work because you can get all those smudges on that. True story. And we also mounted it on strain gauges such that it was pressure sensitive, which was an innovation that we brought, and so on and so forth. So, not having gotten what I wanted continues to amaze and disappoint. And what I want to do now is fast forward to today. ChatGPT, generative AI. You know what my reaction to that is? I get nauseated. I think, oh my God, how wrong, forgive the bluntness of that, you, famous person who brought back neural nets, for saying over and over again that these large language models are really close to being artificially generally intelligent. Give me a break. What are you smoking? What fame are you seeking? What money do you need to satisfy your ego? So the question is, what do I still want? I still want conversational machines. I want a cybernetic viewpoint on these things. I want a humanities and technology, a science and soft. I want an analog and digital synthesis. That's what cybernetics always was. growing up in that era of people saying, oh, neurophysiology and brains and neurons and stuff like that, that's cool. But we got this digital machine over here and it's got zeros and ones and it's going to compute. Well, that computing is pretty powerful. And what is that computing equivalent? Oh, McCullen-Pitts, we're going to do this neural net thing and we're going to build a theory and we're going to say, theoretically, neural nets are equivalent to Turing machines. And by the way, neural nets are like brains and Turing machines are like computers, other people said. Minsky and Papert said. Therefore, computers will be brains. Wrong answer. It's still a wrong answer. So I still want sensibility. Sensibility of the humane, sensibility of the analog. I want common sense in, oh come on, somebody said recently, we're statistical creatures because that's what the brain is based on, and therefore these LLMs, which are statistical, would be smart. What are you smoking? I don't get it. I just don't get it. So what I hope for, and what, as I premised early on, I still want this, and the question is, what needs to be done that I haven't done in order to get that? I'm not sure. I'm trying it here. I'm offering it as a question if you're interested in that question. What are we not doing that we need to do, that we might learn how to do in order to get somewhere that we haven't gotten yet, which is to be sensible about this thing called intelligence, which is not a property of a box, but a property of a relationship? Can we change the culture sufficiently to revise its errors of thinking that rational cognitive thinking is the answer to everything, so that's all we need? A colleague of mine asked me to get in touch with a current author who's written a bestseller called The Anxious Generation, which is about the difficulty that young people are having with social media and all of the things that come with the distortion of living. My colleague Peter Tuddenham is interested, and I am too, in the fact that children today don't know how to go outside and play because they've been like this so much of their lives. So what to do differently, I don't have an answer for, but I invite all into the conversation. And I don't think it's appropriate now to go into what was it about PASC or what was it about cybernetics. And I don't have this glorious set of moments that you had at an earlier stage, at a more important stage, but I do want to say I had the disadvantage of having computers in front of me in an era when people would be confused by what computers seemed to be doing. But you at the BCL had no machines. And so you had your imagination. As Dave said a moment ago, what was the biological computer? It was you.
You know, the notion that it was called a biological computer lab has come back to me many times. What was that idea, biology and computer? Now, I have to say, and we've had this argument before, I think, but I slightly disagree with you, but how? You know, this is really tricky, you know, how to take what I was saying about where we start, what we assume, and what we stand on when we critique. So while I'm not about to, you know, as a psychoanalyst, certainly I hear all the time about the growing anxiety among kids and the difficulty of working with children, never mind crazy adults. But I think the problem with the algorithm and generative AI is what's been done with it, of course, because what's really important to notice is that it's not thinking like humans are, but it is doing something we don't do. And it is doing something we can't do, and it uses indeterminacy to do it. And it belongs to the lineage of cybernetics, and so we're in it.
I love this argument. Why does it constitute a disagreement?
Because I would not say, what are they smoking? Or what are they doing, as you did.
Okay,
of course.
Good. You're not as dismissive as I like to be.
Yeah, well, I'm not as theatrical as you can be.
Oh, I don't agree with that.
At least I I don't sing as well.
Are you saying I'm purely theatrical? Are you saying there's no substance?
So I take it quite seriously that there's something like an artificial thinking that is not like the human. I think the real problem is that we keep on thinking it's like the human or better than the human, rather than its own thing. And that it is, it belongs to something that we're developing. It is, I think, an ontological move on biology and on cognition.
Yeah. You're more sophisticated about all this than I am. I'm just more afraid of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I said I want to be really careful. Of course, and if some of my students were here, they would say, but Patricia never touches computers. That's why she loves them so much. I learned my lesson in my office. It's like, hey, somebody come here. I can't get this thing to work. The imagination is very important in all of this. That's what I learned, and I've kept it.
Yeah.
And engage imaginatively with what we ourselves are producing, because we're not producing it alone. There are my friends back there. The investment of capital is really a difficulty.
It's fantastic to hear that you were reading Capital in
With
Patricia. Yeah. And one of the things that you would have come across in Capital is this idea that the technology isn't this autonomous thing, but actually is an embodiment of our social relations and mediates our relationship with the non-human world. And so to kind of sketch an answer to what you're asking for about, well, what should we be doing? It's, unless we change our social relations, our technologies that we produce will just keep damaging us and our labour.
Not only though, they'll feed back to us what we're doing.
Yeah. And Mark talks about how technology under capital is always going to, he has this idea of subsumption, basically. It will strip our skills away and find ways, it will appear to remove the need for labour, but will actually just create a lot of worse skill levels basically needed. And we just keep seeing this, and that's what we're seeing with ML stuff now.
We have to be careful too. Beloved to me, Marx, every word of it. But a certain epistemology and ontology, one could be critical of.
Yeah. No, I think we've got things to bring to Marx as well as needing to remember an awful lot of what he said.
Shantanu.
I just love that you guys brought up Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, because I looked at the graphs in that book.
Which book?
Anxious Generation.
Anxious Generation.
Yes, and I think it relies primarily on graphs that look at social isolation and the emergence of cell phones in the 2010s, right? I just, the thing that I took away from that book is that we need to create scenarios that allow kids to understand how to navigate real life using technology, right? But also, of course, allow them to, play outside or not use them at school. I understand that. But I feel that there are also ways to create these scenarios in classrooms, in protected bubbles, that allow them to understand how life isn't pretty.
What example might you give for a scenario? What do you mean?
An example that I would give for a scenario would maybe be maybe a 2D or 3D immersive curriculum about something like food security, right? Where the kids get to use multimodal tools to understand what a food desert looks like and how they would navigate that.
So, I had, grandchildren who are teenagers, and they're totally engaged with their phones and what we're speaking about. And they also understand, because they're learning it so young, climate change, indigenous populations. I'm thrilled with what my grandchildren come out of their mouth. And while they're talking, the phone never leaves their hand. I mean, they are originary technique, but I agree, there's so much teaching that must involve the technology. I'm sure we all agree with that there's a lot that's troublesome, but to not learn with it in their hands.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, a portrayal of what you're asking for, I think, is available online for free in a novel by Werner Vinge called Rainbow's End. Set not very far in the future, where the advances in medical and informational technology are accelerating so much that kids are 8-year-olds are routinely studying the sorts of things that research assistants are now training themselves.
Here's dangers.
What danger?
I said that just to be nice.
So that's being nice? You just meant it as a threat, but you didn't want to go into it.
No, I sometimes forget that there are dangers. So
I see, you
trying to
remind us,
remember.
including suffering. Jeff?
I'd love to expand on the dangers if
Go.
we could. I think we've already experienced the danger in that these tools exist only because they've hoovered up massive amounts of unconsensual data, unconsensual language, unconsensual images, unconsensual video, unconsensual audio, and so on and so forth.
And energy.
And these tools have simply emerged with massive amounts of funding and, sort of established themselves in culture in a way that, seemingly we're not allowed to question. I think from a society that feels so obligated to question things, it feels like there's almost a fetishism a little bit of this technology in a way.
Yes.
Without being critical of it, without doing the sort of work that you're talking about of, how can you be so critical of cybernetics, of being so associated with war, being associated with destruction, being associated with evil. I would argue there's just as much of an evil in whole-scale theft. There's just as much of an evil in denial of consent completely, of smashing and grabbing and asking for an apology later, and waiting until you're so set up that you just can't be argued against.
Jude, did you have your hand?
Yeah, I don't want to shift, but I want to point to something you said, so I will shift for a moment, if that's okay. You talked about information and Maturana's definition of closure, and we need a new theory, and past, I'm going to try.
All right.
Past talks about the elements of a participant, okay? Organizational closure, openness to information, and I would agree with that, and I think Maturana might agree with it if information, or when information is defined as a difference that makes a difference, which is determined by the whatever of the organism at hand. The third thing would be evolution, Past would say, and the fourth is a mystery, you would say.
Sure, I would.
I don't know what time is, and neither do you.
I really like this contrast that you mentioned with computers. I don't remember the word you used, but you had computers, and then you could play or imagine because you didn't have the computers. I really like this contrast, and I wonder if you could somehow interpolate this more with the intention to see what could we, if you would go back to these times as kind of mentors of yourselves. I don't know, have a conversation
Very
of
nice.
4, something like.
I can start with that, and maybe you can keep going. So when you have this technology in front of you and everybody's telling you that it's getting smaller, cheaper, faster, and it's amazing what you can do with it, you become part of it in the sense of you think within its constraints. And if you only have your imagination, only, he said, if you don't have this machine in front of you whose constraints are bearing down on you because you want to do something with a machine, then I think your imagination is an opening of possibilities rather than and a constraining and a making within what the Turing machine can do. And remember, that was a really impoverished era compared to what we do now. I'm tempted to tell stories, but when I was a boy, our machines were 8K, and we couldn't have any real discs.
Listen, we had cards.
Well, I refuse that. I started taking that. But what would you say about that distinction in terms of Adler's question about where was the limitation of the imagination, which if you had had a machine, you might have paired it. What I would say is I would have forced myself not to think in terms of a machine and to spend perhaps an equal amount of time thinking, well, what do I really want to do independent of the constraint that I'm worried about making this thing run without bugs?
Yeah. That's my imagination.
That's wonderful. I'm going to turn the AC down unless anyone is ready.
That's you thinking.
I've had, my mind went crazy for a little while. I have to come back to it because the machine wasn't not there at biological computer lab. It was always being imagined, and there were constraints on that imagination that came from, I think, mathematics, which there was plenty of, and neural nets, and I mean, there was a beginning of thinking there would be a machine, but the notion that the machine is a machine is what we didn't know. Let me say that. It isn't that there wasn't a machine, but even when you talk about the computer, the machine is something, I think of Deleuze and Guattari, the machinic, that which is artificial, that which is not, that is primary. It's technicity, originary technicity. So it's not that kind of a thing. It's how you could machine something, how you could mechanize, make something, how you could bring forth the artificiality where you think it isn't. Yeah, I really like that. I want to say, because there's so many things we don't think are artificial, but they are. They're not just constructed, but there's always prior planning, there's a way to always think that you're in the process of machining, which is imagination.
Follow up on that, and maybe you can help me with this. Herbert Brun supposedly in those days would go to the machines, because the engineers got off at 5, he would say, and then he would go in and play with them and generate stuff and make really crazy crap too. Yeah. I mean, talk about imagination. He had an imagination with the machine in the sense of the kinds of music that he would put out, and you can have access to that music because there are CDs of this sound waves, etc., etc. So he used that imagination in relation to issues of the machines in the 50s and 60s.
A different cultural approach, in a sense, because when I'm thinking about what I was trying to do, I wasn't framing it as a creative act in which all of Gen AI and so on, it brings me up. Shantanu, you had your hand up earlier, but have we drifted away?
No, not at all. I mean, maybe sort of, but I just wanted to bring up the dangers, right, of I'm looking at this from the point of view of perspective taking, right? Through the use of machines in like collective settings for children, right? Because I'm an educator. And so like when I talk about immersive education, I speak from experience, right? Because we did 2D immersive education as part of like a federal grant when I was in my PhD degree. with kids in Ohio's public schools, and the flack that we got from parents was, you're engineering my child to think in a certain way using machines, right? To take up a perspective that is political, that has social ramifications, but we're giving them the content and allowing them to take those perspectives themselves, right? So it's just emergent, but it can be construed in other ways, is how I look at the dangers, right? The pure chaos that can emerge.
Oh, can I tell a story?
Sure, please.
So before I went to BCL, I was a second grade teacher in a Catholic school. I had 58 kids in my classroom in second grade. And we used to have educational TV, which was the TV on this big iron thing, you had to pull it around. It was terrible. But because there were so many kids in the school, we had shifts. So I actually taught from 1 to 4 instead of 9 to 3. And I had the brilliant idea, of watching television that the kids watched after school in class. So that we could talk about it. This is in the 60s. Wasn't I smart? But I already knew Marshall McLuhan, who had already impacted me a great deal. And you know what happened? The parents complained.
Right. Yeah.
She's watching TV with the kids.
They didn't
And
understand it was a
I couldn't
pedagogical trick.
explain to them what we were doing.
It was a pedagogical
It
trick.
was brilliant talking to kids about what they saw on TV.
How did you diffuse that when those
How did we
parents came to
diffuse
you with
that?
those concerns? Yeah.
Well, it was one crazy parent, and it led us to withdraw from 2 schools on a federal grant.
Yeah, you had to.
So we couldn't avoid it because it's a school district, it's publicly funded, right?
There's something on my mind, but go ahead.
Okay, I was going to move along. But
Please
if
move
you-
along, no.
okay. Peter, do you have a comment?
I wanted to ask about the great diaspora of cybernetics thinkers that emerged from your experiences, all the other people that you touched. I mean, I'm appreciating hearing, about the luminaries and our mentors and who we learn from, and we weren't there to meet most of them. But I think that there's also, hundreds of thousands of people that have been inspired, and so beyond Brian Eno, there's his whole circle from Lou Reed, David Bowie, and Iggy Pop, and that were all also touched by the same thinking. They embedded cybernetics in different ways, and I want to say they used it. Like I've heard, people talk about methodology or tools, not like that. It became embodied and embedded into their practices, and they didn't need to talk about it, but it's evident. And it's probably, so I wonder, do you have a sense of how it spread from your perspective and your work, or from the BCL, and Paul, especially Paul, from like the cybernetic organization and that work you did with Sun and all that? How did that expand like now to a new generation? That had to have changed the way people were thinking about things then, and then grown into other practices. I'm just fascinated by who's not in the room that actually knows this stuff and is using it, and just not talking about it as sophisticated ways as we are.
It's hard to grab onto that question, and it's quite sophisticated. The example that Peter mentions, for example, when I was at Sun Microsystems, in one of the few periods in my life in which I worked at a company that was not my own or a startup or something, with colleagues we developed a way of thinking about leadership and language and the creation of new language and the role of that in innovation and so on and so forth. And we gave copies of this little gray book, as we call it, to everyone in the marketing department. And it didn't go any further than that. So it was a hashtag fail. Why? I don't have time or necessarily even the reasonings for it, but it was a classic case of individuals and organizations keeping themselves as what they already are. It's resistance to change. It's a conventional thing. We had ways of proposing to a 40,000 person organization, which Sun was at the time, how to make change, but we were not in the right position. If we were the head of it, if we were Bill Gates turned Microsoft completely toward the internet single-handedly, because he had the power, he's at the top of the hierarchy. But the question is always, how do you do that, et cetera? You could say, well, you have to be Margaret Mead and realize that it's a small community that changes things. So I can't easily grasp that. You're asking a question that's a bit beyond. So I guess in general, and help me with this paraphrase. Yeah, what happened? Why didn't it keep going? What
BCL?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I can't remember the dates exactly, but I realized that when I arrived at BCL, it was no longer getting funded. And I didn't know what MIT was, but I think Heinz said something like they didn't I remember what he said. I didn't understand what it meant. It was on my first conversation with him. They thought that we wanted to do a tape recording. They didn't understand what he must have proposed. And he mentioned MIT, where they were going to make little machines that hit the wall, like those, like turtles or something. I mean, he realized that the money was going to go some other way. And so I, of course, being so new to everything, didn't realize that I was sort of in the wake of something, of biological. You know, I want to say that I have actually chaired 48 dissertations in my history as an academic, and every one of those people, every one of those students, who most of whom are now, you know, professors, full professors, have heard about cybernetics, have heard about the biological computer lab, you know, have a certain real deep investment in trying to understand technology, how to treat it, how to think about it, how to teach about it. And I think that's really, it's a hugely important task at this point, you know, in our history.
Someone who hasn't spoken first before we repeat.
Institutionally, I think it was a surprising occurrence. You know, BCL was in Champaign-Urbana. You know, who would want to be there, but they were there. And the people that came through were, oh, my favorite story, you know, I really love Goddard Gunter's work, as you know. And Heinz knew that I did, and I had read it and thought I understood a three-valued logic, which I had been after all my life, 3 values rather than 2. And so Goddard Gunter came, and Heinz said, you can come to lunch, but you shouldn't talk. I said, why? Oh, are you ready? He said, I don't think he thinks a woman can think about these things.
Oh.
Yeah.
There's still people that think that.
What?
There's still people that think that way.
Yeah, I did talk, I think. I don't think I
Did you persuade him?
I forget now. That's the story's too good to remember what happened after.
Well, he changed his mind too, didn't he?
Yeah. But I think that was a rare occurrence. What happened when I was at the biological computer lab, because it wasn't being funded, it became really creative, but it can't survive.
Dave?
Yeah, I just wonder whether the perception on the part of the funding agencies that led to the defunding of cybernetics may have been the resolution on the part of so many cyberneticists to slow down or halt the increase of the power of men over men in favor of increasing the power of men over nature. And yes, I'm using the term deliberately.
Yeah, I get it.
And might also explain why, although a little later, the Soviet Union also defunded cybernetics. It was regarded as too rational.
I'm not sure. The story that Stuart Umpleby knows better than I do and has written about, but we would also hear Heinz tell this story. I'm sure there are other people in this room who would firsthand know what I'm about to say. Heinz said that year after year, when he wanted money for the BCL, he would go to Washington, he would come back with the money. And one year he went there, and they said, oh, I'm sorry, you know, we're going to consolidate all of the money that's going to stuff like yours, AI and so on. And you got to go talk to that guy, and he's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So Heinz goes up to talk to Marvin Minsky expecting to have the usual allocation, very modest, I'm sure it was for the VCL. And Marvin said no. And it was that simple.
And that's what he told us. And it was a terribly important moment because it reduced cybernetics to Minsky and what they were doing at MIT.
Yeah. And
which led much more to things like understanding surveillance and technology, which was not what was VCL.
What was this reason? What did Minsky say why?
What did Minsky say why? I don't know. I don't think he had to. He was already part of the movement that didn't want to use the word cybernetics in 1956 when they had the famous Dartmouth conference and wanted to take a cognitive psychology approach, is that the right word? Cognitive approach to AI and to keep going the symbolic route. And they consciously did not use the word cybernetics and wanted to not, you pick your place on the spectrum, wanted not to acknowledge it, wanted to repudiate it, and that's where the phrase artificial intelligence came from. And I knew Minsky a little bit. I took undergraduate classes and so on when Pass came to Cambridge to consult with Negroponte and with the group at ArcMac when I was the architecture chief. It was clear that Marvin knew in his soul that the answer to intelligent machines was what is now still called symbolic AI. So this world, you got a doorway, you got a knob, the knob's relation to the door is such and such, we're just going to stick that in a database and then add some reasoning on top and we're going to get intelligence in 5 years. And they said 5 years, every 5 years for 50 years. And now they're still doing it with AGI and so on and so forth with neural nets, right? They're just repeating the same thing. It's, what do they smoke? Oh, I'm sorry.
And where do I get it?
I heard from Ernst von Glasserfeld's story that it had to do with second order, in the sense that second cybernetics led to ethics and responsibility, and there's no way the military wanted individuals to take responsibility for their thinking and doing.
It could be that in part.
And that what happened was with that there was a split within cybernetics, according to Ernst's story, where there were certain people decided, no, I'm a researcher, I don't affect what, and they went off and generated this new thing called artificial intelligence.
Rather than second order.
And it's said by those who knew Wiener, Gordon Pask among them, that Wiener knew all about second order and consciously chose not to forefront it, knowing the peril that that would place him in terms of wanting to persuade the people.
We learned, Heinz taught us that about.
And he wrote that letter to the military when they were looking for his papers, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm glad you can't find it, and I'm not helping you because you're too much into industrial militarization. So
and post Hiroshima as well.
And the letter to the trade unions.
Then there is also the story about Gadagunder. It was
the what version?
My story about Gadagunder was meant to also, as you said, it was men. There were women, but it was male.
Still is.
Yeah, male
Silicon
dominated, and I think it makes a difference.
Silicon Valley, the bros. Jeff, did you have something?
Well, I just couldn't imagine something more illustrative than, you ask a relatively simple question of, well, why? Why was that funding not? And the answer is power doesn't need to give a reason why. Power operates from a place where you can scream why all you want, primal therapy wise or otherwise, and it simply won't answer. It will scoff and laugh and move on, or simply not notice at all, even more upsetting.
I laughed when you said that, but I really wanted to cry.
Yeah, and I just, it seems like, a discipline so, I don't want to say obsessed, but, dedicated to the idea of asking those questions to run into, that kind of brick wall. That's upsetting.
Yeah, so I'm still obsessed by this question of what we still want. I would like to ask you that question. What do we still want, and what might we do differently in order to try to get it?
What we want, or what do I want?
You.
Or what you want? I'll tell you.
I went from you to we, and I apologize. what do you want, and what would you suggest be done differently? Did you see what I did?
Yeah, what?
What? Yeah.
I was still thinking about power and the great moment of reading Foucault on power, to remember that power doesn't just come down, but is force. So it sets off a lot, and so we have to remember our power and how to use it. And I don't think Heinz cried over not getting funded. We went forward and did cybernetics of cybernetics and created, and I didn't really know until later, wow, that was the end of BCL that he was telling me about. I remember saying to him, what do we do now? And Heinz was like, we hold on by the edges of our fingers. Some dramatic kind of whatever that is, yeah. I don't know, my new world of trying to make a difference is psychoanalysis. Why? I have no idea. But I love the unconscious and the thought of the unconscious as indeterminacy, as profoundly undermining human superiority and agency and the whole thing. Cognition. Probably one of the things that BCL did not appeal to me, it was too much about cognition for me, and not enough about something else. So psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is so alive in our society, and I'm not sure what the ideas there could use some messing around with. So that's what I want to do.
That's a path.
That's a path for me to rethink therapeutic mode, to move away from treating the individual and instead to see them embedded.
Yeah. Any other comments? Please, Kate.
I'm just sitting here listening.
I saw that.
And I'm thinking a lot of things, and so maybe this, quite likely, might not be very articulate. It isn't already. But one of the things that I think a lot about, and you may see, and Paul, you often ask about cybernetics and where we go, and is it dead, is it alive, whatever. But something that I often think about is just being joyful, and that's why I came to this community, really, because in some of my other academic communities, lovely as they are, there was just a lovingness in this particular community that just made everything feel so dynamic, so resonant, and so performative in the sense that I think of performance as a violinist. And so I think, where am I going with this? I guess I think that I run into a lot of issues with cybernetics. Working on a book within a tenure track position, and there's a lot of resistance to it. It seems like there's a sort of allergy to the word.
Yeah.
And I say, why? And it's funny, the answer to that is usually fairly ambiguous. I can't get a great reason for it. It's something to do with problematic past, whatever. And I say, well, I have these colleagues and we're very loving, and I work with this guy, Paul, and we sing sometimes. I mean, it's nice, but there's some sort of resistance. And so that's why I like to keep talking about joy and fun and love, which frequently comes up. Do you bring that up a lot?
Playfulness.
Playfulness. Yeah. So there wasn't much there, but I guess I just.
Yes, there was.
Yes, there was.
Thank you. So we've been here a little more than an hour, and we had allocated more time, but it's been a very long day. I would like to
sing.
Always. But that isn't what I'm going to say.
Can I tell one story about you?
Oh my God.
Yes, please. You and me, that is.
Oh, okay, well, yeah.
I met Paul like 2 years before tenure, remember?
Yes.
So I had such a writing block. And I wanted to say something about writing.
You have a writing block?
Oh my God. Kate, I think we were talking about this, that one of the most difficult things to do is to change the writing form of a discipline. Psychoanalysis writes the same, every paper is the same. And it's really hard to get published. You can see it at that place of creativity. Because of course, that's where the canons are made, that's where all the rules are made in writing. Because when you're talking, it's great, but writing, you have to get published to get tenure, you can't just be smart. And so I had so much trouble thinking the way they wanted me to think. Are you not going to remember this?
Keep going.
We were in New York together, and I said, let me tell you about this book I want. And we walked all over New York City, and I told him the whole book. The entire book that became Ends of Ethnography.
Yes, which was your first.
It didn't get written before tenure. I got tenure anyway. But I knew because I had told you
Yeah.
there was a book there, and you
Yeah.
listened.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved every minute. I remember walking around
Oh,
59th Street.
Yeah, 59th Street.
Yeah.
And what's the title?
The Ends of Ethnography.
Ends of
It's
Ethnography.
pretty deep.
Her first book.
I love that little book.
I want to invite again, if you'll forgive the repetition, to ponder the question of questions, it's in the session description, of how you started here and what you wanted from what you thought you were finding when you started, and what you don't have yet and what you might do differently to get it. And we thank you for your time and attention.